August 6th marked the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act, a historic piece of legislation that was one of the hard-won victories of the civil rights movement. Just hours before the first Republican presidential debate, President Obama addressed the nation in a video conference yesterday to mark the anniversary. Alongside him were Attorney General Loretta Lynch and Representative John Lewis. Mr. Lewis was a prominent figure in the fight for voting rights. It is a sad state of affairs in the nation that the voting rights of people of color and poor people 50 years later are still under threat. The Supreme Court in 2013 ruled against a major section of the VRA that helped to enforce the right to vote. Earlier this week, a federal appeals court struck down a controversial Texas voter ID law, saying it was discriminatory against people of color, and several other states, such as North Carolina, are seeing their controversial voting laws being challenged. Joining me today to discuss the state of voting rights, as well as the history that led us to where we are, is Berman. He is a contributing writer for The Nation magazine and an investigative journalism fellow at the Nation Institute. His new book is called Give Us the Ballot, The Modern Struggle for Voting Rights in America. He has written extensively about American politics, civil rights, and the intersection of money and politics. His stories have appeared in the New York Times, Rolling Stone, and The Guardian. His first book was entitled Herding Donkeys, The Fight to Rebuild the Democratic Party and Reshape American Politics. Welcome to Uprising, Ari.
Thanks for having me back, Sonali.
Well, first, how historic was the Voting Rights Act when it was passed and signed in 1965? Did the police violence against civil rights marches in places like Selma, Alabama, generate so much sympathy for the civil rights movement that it sort of lent momentum for that bill to pass?
Yeah, that's absolutely what happened, and it was an incredibly historic piece of legislation. Even at the time, I think everyone knew how consequential this was, and you have to remember, Congress passed 3 Civil Rights Acts before the Voting Rights Act. They passed the Civil Rights Act of 1957, of 1960, and of 1964, and none of them solved the problem of voting discrimination. And indeed, we saw in Selma, Alabama, where only 2% of African Americans were registered to vote in early 1965. The violence in Selma, not just in Selma, but in Mississippi and all across the South, was indicative of how hard the struggle was and how much blood was shed for the Voting Rights Act. And so the Voting Rights Act was a culmination of decades of struggle to win this right. And also, it was a recognition that the Voting Rights Act had to try to solve this problem once and for all, that Congress couldn't pass a Voting Rights Act of 1966 and 1967 and 1968 like they had done with the previous civil rights laws. There had to be one Voting Rights Act. It had to address the problem, and it had to be enforced.